The summer of '73 was meaner than a rattlesnake with a toothache. In Dry Creek, the sun hammered down like God's own anvil, baking the earth until it cracked like old leather. The last rain had been a memory 3 months back, and what little water remained in the wells tasted of iron and despair. That Tuesday morning, when the freight wagon rolled down Main Street, folks gathered like buzzards to carrion. Word had spread faster than wildfire. Flour had finally arrived. Not much, mind you, just enough to keep the town from starving outright. Reverend Whitmore and Jake Braden, who owned the saloon, stood at the wagon's tail, dividing the precious sacks with all the fairness of Solomon himself, half to the church for the widows and orphans, half to the saloon for paying customers. It was then that Jonah Pike came crawling into town. He didn't walk so much as drag himself forward, one hand pressed to his ribs, the other clawing at the packed dirt. His clothes hung off him like Spanish moss, and his boots, what was left of them, had holes you could spit through. The man was tall when he stood. You could tell, but hunger had whittled him down to sinew and stubborn will. The crowd parted as he made his way toward Grange and Daughter Bakery, where the smell of fresh bread tortured the air. Every soul in Dry Creek knew that smell. It was the difference between living and merely surviving. Thomas Grange had built that bakery with his own hands 20 years back, and his daughter Lenora had taken to the trade like a duck to water. Jonah stopped at the bakery's doorstep, lifted his head, and spoke in a voice dry as August corn husks. "Ma'am," he said to Lenora, who stood in the doorway with flour dusting her apron like snow, "I ain't asking for charity, just the burnt crusts, or whatever might have fallen on the floor. I can work it off when I'm able." Lenora Grange was 23 that summer, with hair black as coal and eyes that could freeze a man at 20 paces. She was beautiful in the way a desert sunset is beautiful, harsh, unforgiving, and liable to leave you blind if you stared too long. She looked down at Jonah Pike like he was something scraped off a boot heel. "Work?" she laughed, and it was a sound like breaking glass. "What work could you do? You can't even stand proper." She turned to the gathered crowd, her voice rising like a preacher at revival. "Look here, folks. This man wants my burnt crusts. Says he'll work for them." The laughter spread through the crowd like a disease. "Maybe I should hire him to scare the crows from my father's grave." Old Thomas had passed the winter before, leaving Lenora the bakery and a heart that had calcified like limestone. Some said grief had made her cruel. Others whispered she'd always had a mean streak, just hid it better when her father was alive. Jonah didn't flinch at her words. He'd been past pride for 100 miles now. "Please," he said simply, "I ain't et in 4 days." That should have softened her. It didn't. Lenora disappeared into the bakery and returned with a bucket. For a moment, hope flickered in Jonah's eyes, until she upended it over his head. Wash water, gray with flour and yeast, drenched him where he knelt. "There," she announced. "Now you're clean enough to beg somewhere else." The crowd roared. Even Marshall Cooper chuckled behind his handlebar mustache. Only a few faces showed no mirth. Miss Odie, the herb woman, pressed her lips thin as paper. Young Amos, the orphan boy who helped at the livery, looked like he might cry. A small voice piped up, Sally Morrison's youngest, clutching her mother's skirts. "Mama, why's that man crawling? Mrs." Morrison hushed her quick, but the question hung in the air like smoke. Jonah Pike raised his head one last time. His eyes met Lenora's, and something passed between them. Not hatred, not even anger, just acknowledgement. He nodded once, as if settling a debt in his mind, then turned and crawled back the way he'd come. The crowd dispersed, returning to their business, their entertainment concluded. Lenora went back to her ovens, humming a church hymn, but Miss Odie and young Amos followed Jonah's trail, finding him collapsed beneath a mesquite tree at the town's edge. "Boy," Miss Odie said to Amos, "help me get him to my place." They half-carried, half-dragged Jonah to Miss Odie's shack among the salt cedars. It wasn't much, walls of weathered boards, a roof that leaked starlight, but it was shelter. They laid him on a straw pallet, and Miss Odie set about her work. She was a small woman, skin the color of polished walnut, with hands that knew every herb and root for 50 miles around. Some folks called her a witch, others called her a saint. She answered to neither, just went about her business of keeping people alive when the good Lord seemed inclined otherwise. "Amos," she said, grinding something pungent in her mortar. "Fetch water from the creek, the clean part, upstream from where the cattle cross." The boy ran off, glad to be useful. Miss Odie studied Jonah's face, reading the lines like a map of hard country. "You're a long way from home, mister." Jonah's eyes fluttered open. They were gray as winter sky, with something burning deep inside like a banked fire. "Ain't got one," he rasped. "Everyone's got a home," Miss Odie said, spooning bitter tea between his cracked lips. "Sometimes we just ain't found it yet." For 3 days, Jonah Pike balanced on the knife edge between living and dying. Miss Odie fed him broth made from prairie chicken and wild onion. Amos brought fresh water and sat by the pallet, telling stories about the horses at the livery to fill the silence. On the 4th morning, Jonah sat up. The gray was gone from his skin, and his eyes had cleared. He looked at Miss Odie with something like wonder. "Why?" he asked. She shrugged, adding wood to her small stove. "Same reason the rain falls on good folk and bad alike. It's what's needed." Jonah was quiet for a long spell. Then, that woman, at the bakery. "Lenora Grange," Miss Odie supplied. "Lost her daddy last winter. Been hard as a horseshoe ever since." "I know about loss," Jonah said quietly. He didn't elaborate, and Miss Odie didn't pry. In the territories, everyone carried ghosts. As the days passed, Jonah grew stronger. He helped Amos with his chores, repaired Miss Odie's leaking roof, set snares for rabbits in the brush. His hands, we learned, knew work. They spoke of farms and ranches, of building and tending, of a life before whatever had brought him crawling to Dry Creek. At night, he'd sit outside the shack, staring at the lights of town. Sometimes Amos would join him, and they'd sit in companionable silence, listening to the coyotes sing to the stars. "You going back there?" Amos asked one evening. Jonah was quiet so long the boy thought he hadn't heard. Then, "Maybe, when I'm ready." "What for?" That lady was meaner than a stepped-on snake. Jonah almost smiled. "Sometimes, boy, a debt ain't about money. Sometimes it's about showing folks what they really are." Amos didn't understand, but he nodded anyway. In the territories, you learned young that grown folks had their own peculiar ways of keeping accounts. The thing that changed Jonah Pike from a broken man to something else entirely came on a Sunday morning. Miss Odie had gone to gather herbs, and Amos was at the livery. Jonah was alone when he heard it, a horse, hurt and scared, somewhere in the brush. He found the animal tangled in old barbed wire, a black gelding with eyes wild as midnight. The horse had been trying to free itself, and the wire had cut deep. Blood painted its legs like war paint. "Easy," Jonah murmured, approaching slow as molasses. "Easy now." It took him 2 hours to calm the horse enough to start working on the wire. His hands, despite their size, were gentle as a mother's touch. He talked the whole time. Nonsense, mostly. Just letting the animal know he was there. He was helping. Everything would be all right. When the last wire fell away, the horse stood trembling, unsure whether to run or stay. Jonah stepped back, giving it room to choose. The gelding took one step, then another, then stopped. It turned its head and looked at Jonah with eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the world. "You're free," Jonah said. "Go on if you want." But the horse didn't go. It stood there, sides heaving, and waited. Jonah spent the rest of the day tending the animal's wounds, using Miss Odie's salves and his own knowledge. By evening, the horse was following him around like a dog. "Needs a name," Amos said when he returned and saw them together. Jonah looked at the black horse, then back toward town where the bakery's chimney smoke rose like incense to an unforgiving sky. "Karma," he said finally. "His name is Karma." Miss Odie, returning with her herb basket, heard the name and smiled her knowing smile. "Karma," she repeated, tasting the word. That's a name with weight to it. Yes, ma'am, Jonah agreed. Some things need weight to be properly carried. As the sun set that Sunday, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold, Jonah Pike stood straighter than he had in months. The hunger was still there, carved into his bones. But something else had taken root alongside it. Not vengeance, that was too simple a word. Not justice, that implied he was owed something. No. What grew in Jonah Pike was more patient than vengeance, more personal than justice. It was the quiet determination of a man who'd been shown his lowest point and decided to rise anyway, not despite the cruelty he'd endured, but because of it. In the shack that night, as Miss Odie's herbs perfumed the air and Amos snored on his pallet, Jonah lay awake planning, not planning revenge. That would make him no better than those who'd laughed. Planning something else entirely. Karma, he whispered to the darkness. And somewhere outside, the black horse whickered in response. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent as always to human suffering and human hope alike. But Jonah Pike had learned something in his weeks of wandering, something in that moment of public shame, something in the eyes of a horse tangled in wire. Sometimes the only way to change a story is to refuse the role you've been given and write your own ending instead. Tomorrow, he would start that rewriting. Tonight, he would rest and gather his strength. Because Jonah Pike had business in Dry Creek, not the business of revenge, but the business of becoming. And somewhere in town, Lenora Grange counted her day's earnings and tried not to think about gray eyes that had looked at her without hatred, only understanding. She failed, and that failure troubled her more than she cared to admit. The wheel had started turning. Where it would stop, only time and human choices would tell. The days that followed were measured in sweat and sawdust. Jonah Pike rose before the sun, his hands finding work like water finds its level. He patched Miss Odie's roof with salvaged tin and tar, reinforcing it against the winter rains that would come eventual-like. He dug a new privy, lined it proper with stones hauled from the creek bed. His movements were deliberate, economical, a man who'd learned not to waste motion or breath. Young Amos became his shadow. The boy had never known his father, and something in Jonah's quiet strength drew him like iron filings to a magnet. Together they set snares in the brush, checking them at dawn when the desert was painted purple and the air still held a hint of cool. "Why'd you name him Karma?" Amos asked one morning as they watched the black gelding crop sparse grass. The horse's wounds were healing clean, pink skin showing through where the wire had cut deepest. Jonah considered his words, hands busy mending a broken bridle he'd found. "You know what karma means, boy?" "No, sir. It's an old word from far-off places. Means what goes around comes around. What you send out into the world has a way of finding its way back." He tested the leather, found it sound, good or bad. It all comes home to roost eventually. Amos pondered this as they walked back, 2 rabbits dangling from his belt. "So you're gonna get back at Miss Lenora?" "No." The word came quick and firm. "Getting back at folks just sends more bad into the world. I aim to send out something different." That evening, Miss Odie taught him to brew her bitter root tea. "Desert trumpet for strength," she explained. "Crushing dried stems. Chaparro for the blood. Little bit of honey when we can get it, to make the medicine go down easier." Her hands moved with the certainty of long practice. And Jonah watched close, memorizing. He'd known healing women before, back in Texas where he'd been raised. They were the ones who kept communities whole when doctors were 3 days' ride away and usually drunk besides. "You had a family," Miss Odie said. It wasn't a question. Jonah's hands stilled on the mortar. "Had," he agreed. "Cholera?" "Comanche." The word fell between them like a stone into still water. "Came home from moving cattle to find smoke. Wife, 2 boys, nothing left but char and memory." Miss Odie nodded, understanding the weight of such losses. Out here, death came in many forms: disease, drought, violence, despair. The survivors were those who found reasons to keep breathing when breath itself became burden. "That why you were crawling when you got here?" "Sold everything to pay for the burials. Proper stones, proper words said over them. Then I started walking. Figured I'd walk until I found a reason to stop. He looked at his hands, seeing strength returning to them. Guess I found it. They worked in companionable silence after that, the only sound the grinding of herbs and the distant yip of coyotes. When full dark came, Jonah stepped outside to check on Karma. The horse nickered softly, nuzzling his shoulder. At night, dreams came unbidden. Not of his lost family, those ghosts had made their peace. Instead, he dreamed of laughter sharp as glass, of flour-dusted hands pouring water over his head, of a crowd's amusement at his abasement. But strangest of all, he dreamed of Lenora Grange's eyes in that final moment, not cruel, but afraid. Afraid of what? He couldn't say. He'd wake in the darkness, listening to the tick of cooling wood in Miss Odie's stove, and wonder at the fear he'd seen. What made a person pour cruelty on another's suffering? What walls did they build to keep compassion out? It's not about her, he'd whisper to himself. It's about who I choose to be. By the third week, Jonah had transformed Miss Odie's hardscrabble plot. He'd built a chicken coop from scrap lumber, traded repair work for 3 laying hens. He'd dug irrigation channels from the creek, creating a small garden where Miss Odie could grow her healing herbs. The work bronzed his skin and filled out his frame. The ghost-hollow look left his eyes. Amos helped when he wasn't at the livery, learning by watching. You know a lot about building, the boy observed. Man learns what he needs to learn, Jonah replied, showing him how to notch logs proper. Had a farm once, 160 acres of decent land, if you knew how to work it. Will you get another farm? Jonah looked toward town, where smoke rose from chimneys and life went on without him. Maybe, or maybe I'll find something else needs doing. It was Karma who showed him what that might be. The horse had taken to following Jonah everywhere, patient as a dog. One afternoon, Jonah fashioned a hackamore from rope and slipped it over Karma's head. The horse stood quiet, trusting. You sure about that? Miss Odie asked from her doorway. Wild horses don't always take to riding. He's not wild, Jonah said, running his hand along Karma's neck. Just lost for a while. He swung up bareback, and Karma stood steady as a rock. They moved together natural as breathing, the horse responding to the slightest shift of weight. Amos whooped with delight, and even Miss Odie smiled. They rode the boundaries of Miss Odie's land first, then ventured further. Jonah found himself gravitating toward town, but always stopping short, watching from a distance. He saw the routines of Dry Creek, the morning water haul, the afternoon gathering at Braden's saloon, the evening promenade of respectable folks, and always the smoke from Grange and Daughter Bakery, carrying the smell of bread like a taunt on the wind. You're gonna have to go back sometime, Miss Odie said one evening as she served up stew made from Jonah's rabbits and her garden vegetables. I know. Waiting for something particular? Jonah considered. Waiting to be ready. Man only gets one chance to show folks who he really is. Want to make sure I get it right. Miss Odie hummed her agreement. Like my grandmama used to say, best revenge is a life well lived, not looking for revenge. Jonah corrected gently. No, then what? He was quiet long enough that Amos thought he wouldn't answer. Then, redemption, maybe. Not for me, for them, for her, for a town that's forgotten how to see suffering. The old woman's eyes sharpened. That's a heavy load to carry, mister. Good thing I've got a strong horse. The morning that changed everything came like any other. Jonah was teaching Amos to braid leather when they heard hoofbeats approaching fast. Jake Braden's boy came tearing up on a lathered pony. Miss Odie, he called. Pa says come quick. There's been an accident at the mine. Cave in. Men are hurt bad. Miss Odie was already gathering her medicines. How many? 6, maybe 7. Doc Morrison's drunk again. The boy spit in disgust. Pa said you're the only one might help. I'll come, Jonah said, already saddling Karma. Miss Odie looked at him steady. You sure? Going back to town like this? Men are hurt, he said simply. Rest doesn't matter. They rode hard, Karma keeping pace with Miss Odie's mule easy. The copper mine lay 2 miles past town, and already they could see dust rising, hear the shouts of men. The scene was chaos. The shaft entrance had collapsed, trapping men inside. Those who'd made it out lay groaning in the dirt, covered in dust and blood. Jonah took it all in with one sweep of his eyes, then dismounted. "You!" He pointed at a young miner standing slack-jawed. "Get timbers from the equipment shed. You," another man. "Bring all the rope you can find. Move!" His voice carried the authority of a man who'd given orders before, expected them obeyed. The miners jumped to action. Jonah examined the cave-in with an engineer's eye, finding where the support beams had failed. "Can't dig straight through," he told the mine foreman. "Whole thing'll come down. Got to shore it up as we go." For the next 6 hours, Jonah Pike worked like a man possessed. He directed the rescue efforts with calm efficiency, personally leading the team that crawled into the unstable shaft. Twice more the ceiling tried to come down. Twice Jonah's knowledge of support structures kept it at bay. When they brought the last man out, alive, though barely, Jonah was gray with rock dust and exhaustion. His hands bled from handling rough timber. He didn't seem to notice. The crowd that had gathered parted as he walked to where Miss Odie tended the wounded. Among them stood Lenora Grange, her arms full of clean bandages from the bakery. She stared at Jonah like she was seeing a ghost. Their eyes met across the distance. Jonah nodded once, the same nod he'd given that day on her doorstep, then turned to help carry an injured man to a wagon. "That's him," someone whispered. "The beggar Lenora drove off." "Don't look like no beggar to me," another replied. The whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire through dry grass. Jonah paid them no mind, focused on the work at hand. But Lenora heard every word, each one sharp as a needle. When the wounded were loaded and the immediate crisis passed, Jake Braden approached Jonah with his hand out. "Mister, I don't know who you are, but you saved lives today. Dry Creek owes you." Jonah looked at the offered hand for a long moment, then shook it firm. "Name's Jonah Pike, and the only thing owed is what we owe each other, to help when help's needed." He mounted Karma and rode away without another word, leaving behind a town that suddenly had to reconsider everything it thought it knew about the man who'd crawled down Main Street begging for bread. That night, as Jonah washed rock dust from his hair, Amos asked, "Why'd you help, after how they treated you?" Jonah considered his answer. "Because, boy, who we are isn't decided by how others treat us. It's decided by how we choose to act, regardless." "But they laughed at you." "They did. Don't that make you angry?" "Anger's like fire." Jonah said slowly, "Can use it to burn everything down, or use it to forge something better. I choose the forge." Outside, Karma whickered softly, and somewhere in town, Lenora Grange lay sleepless, seeing over and over a man covered in rock dust and blood, saving lives with hands that had once begged for her burnt crusts. The sound of her laughter that day haunted her now like a sin she couldn't confess. The morning Jonah Pike rode back into Dry Creek proper, the sun hung like a brass button against white flannel sky. 3 weeks had passed since the mine rescue, and in that time, stories had grown like tumbleweeds. Some said he'd held up a whole mountain with his bare hands. Others claimed he'd once been an engineer for the railroad before tragedy struck. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between. He'd chosen noon for his return, when Braden's saloon would be full and Main Street busy with commerce. Karma's hooves rang against the hard-packed earth like an announcement. Jonah sat straight in the saddle he'd bought with money earned from carpentry work. Wearing clean clothes Miss Odie had mended with careful stitches. The bat-wing doors of the saloon seemed to breathe in the midday heat. Jonah dismounted, tied Karma to the rail, and pushed through into the dim interior. Every conversation died. Jake Braden stood behind the bar, polishing a glass that didn't need polishing. The usual crowd was there, miners off shift, ranch hands in town for supplies, traveling men waiting for the next stage, and in the corner, 2 strangers in black dusters despite the heat, playing cards with the mechanical precision of professionals. "Afternoon," Jonah said to the room at large. His voice carried clear and calm. "Name's Jonah Pike. Some of you might remember me." I came through here a while back in a bad way. Someone coughed. Ice clinked in a glass. I was the man who crawled down Main Street and begged for bread at the bakery. He let that sit a moment. Was turned away with wash water over my head. The silence grew teeth. One of the strangers in black looked up from his cards, eyes sharp as a hawk's. Now, Jonah continued, moving to the bar. I'm not here to call out debts or settle scores. Man makes his own way in this world, and I've made mine. Just wanted to reintroduce myself proper, let folks see that the same man who crawls can also stand. He reached into his pocket, drew out coins, earned honest, and laid them on the bar. Mr. Braden, I'd like to buy a round for the house. Every man here. Jake Braden's weathered face cracked into something approaching a smile. Your money's good here, Pike. As drinks were poured and handed round, the tension eased a notch. Men nodded. Some raised their glasses in acknowledgement, but Jonah noticed the two strangers hadn't touched theirs. Including those gentlemen, Jonah said, indicating the card players. The taller of the two, face sharp as an axe blade, smiled without warmth. Appreciate the gesture, friend, but we don't drink with everyone. His accent spoke of eastern cities, of cobblestones and corruption. Fair enough, Jonah replied. Every man chooses his own company. He turned to leave, had almost reached the doors when the shorter stranger spoke. You're the one pulled them miners out. I helped. Jonah agreed without turning. Useful man to know. Might have work for someone with your skills. Now, Jonah did turn. He took in their measure with one long look, the careful way they sat. Backs to the wall, the bulge of iron under their coats, the soft hands that had never known honest labor. I choose my own work, he said. Good day, gentlemen. He pushed through the doors into blazing daylight. The street had filled with onlookers, word spreading fast as fever. And there, standing in the doorway of her bakery like she'd been carved from salt, was Lenora Grange. She wore blue calico, flour dusting the fabric like snow on distant mountains. Her black hair was pinned severe, but strands had escaped to frame her face. The face that had laughed at his suffering now held something else entirely, uncertainty, maybe, or recognition of a debt that couldn't be paid in coin. Jonah touched his hat brim. Miss Grange. The words seemed to release her from stone. She stepped forward, chin raised in that way he remembered. But her voice when it came was smaller than before. Mr. Pike. They stood there in the street, the whole town watching, waiting for, what, accusations, demands, violence? Instead, Jonah untied Karma and swung into the saddle. Fine day, he observed to no one in particular. Good day for bread making. I'd imagine. Something flashed across Lenora's face. Surprise, maybe, or disappointment that the expected scene wouldn't play out. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. Yes, it is. Good. He clicked his tongue, and Karma started forward. Fresh bread's a blessing in hard country. Folks should appreciate it when they can get it. He rode on down Main Street, leaving confusion in his wake like ripples in a pond. Behind him, Lenora's hands clenched and unclenched in her flour-dusted apron. That evening, Dry Creek buzzed like a disturbed hive. In the saloon, men debated what Pike's game might be. At the general store, women whispered over bolts of cloth. Everyone had an opinion, but nobody had answers. Should have seen Lenora's face, Martha Perkins told her sister. Like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. Serves her right, her sister replied, then glanced around quick to make sure no one had heard. Lenora Grange had a long memory for slights, and nobody wanted to end up on her bad side. In the bakery, Lenora worked her dough with uncommon violence. Her few customers that afternoon found their bread particularly well needed, though her usual chatter was replaced by grim silence. You all right, Miss Lenora? Old Walter Haynes ventured as she wrapped his usual loaf. Fine, she bit out. Why wouldn't I be? Walter took his bread and fled. Word spread. Best to avoid the bakery until her mood improved. But Lenora's mood didn't improve. As evening painted the sky purple and orange, she found herself at the window again and again, looking toward the salt cedars where she'd heard Pike was staying. The sound of her own laughter that day haunted her like a ghost that wouldn't be laid. She'd told herself it was justified. A grown man crawling in the dirt, begging. It was undignified, shameful. She'd been teaching him a lesson about pride, about maintaining standards even in hard times. That's what she told herself then. Now, remembering his calm nod as water dripped from his face, remembering his steady voice today speaking of standing after crawling, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not guilt, she wouldn't name it that, but something close enough to be uncomfortable. At Miss Odie's cabin, Jonah sat with Amos, teaching the boy to work leather. Karma grazed nearby, tails swishing at flies. "Why didn't you call her out?" Amos asked. "Tell everyone how she treated you. What would that accomplish? She'd be shamed, like she shamed you." Jonah's hands never paused in their work. "Shame's a heavy burden. Boy, giving it to others doesn't lighten your own load, just spreads the weight around. Besides, she knows what she did. That's burden enough." "But it ain't fair." "Fair?" Jonah looked up then, eyes distant. "Fair would be my wife and boys still breathing. Fair would be a lot of things that ain't. Man can spend his whole life chasing fair and die empty-handed. Better to chase what's possible." "What's that?" "Better," Jonah said simply. "Always better. Better than you were yesterday. Better than folks expect. Better than your worst impulse. That's a chase worth making." They worked in silence as stars began their nightly show. Then Amos asked, "Those men in black coats, they were trouble, weren't they?" Jonah's hands stilled for just a moment. "You noticed that? Way they sat, way they looked at folks, like they were measuring for coffins." "Smart boy." Jonah resumed his work. "Yes, they're trouble. Question is, trouble for who?" Miles away, in a camp hidden in the Badlands, those same men in black dusters sat by a small fire. The taller one, Silas Creed, cleaned his coat with practiced motions. "Interesting fellow." His partner, Marcus Vale, observed. "Could be useful, or dangerous." Creed countered. "Man who pulls miners from a cave-in might not look kindly on our business. Every man has a price." "Maybe, but something tells me his might be higher than we can pay." Creed spun the cylinder of his pistol, listening to the well-oiled click. "Keep an eye on him. And the woman, the baker, she's got steel in her. Might be she's exactly what we need for the railroad job." They sat in silence, planning their particular brand of trouble while the fire burned down to coals. In the distance, a coyote howled, and another answered. The desert held its breath, waiting. Back in Dry Creek, Lenora Grange finally gave up on sleep. She lit a candle and went to her kitchen, doing what she always did when troubled. She baked. Her hands found comfort in familiar motions, measuring, mixing, kneading. But tonight the work brought no peace. She thought of her father, dead now these 8 months. He'd been a hard man but fair, respected by all. What would he think of what she'd done? What would he say about a daughter who'd mocked a starving man? "You've got your mother's temper," he'd told her once. "Quick to flame, slow to cool. Mind it doesn't burn what you'd rather keep." Her hands stilled in the dough. Outside, a night bird called, lonely in the darkness. Lenora looked at her reflection in the window glass, flour in her hair, shadows under her eyes, mouth set in lines that seemed suddenly harsh. "What am I keeping?" she whispered to the empty room. No answer came. Just the tick of the cooling stove and the whisper of desert wind against the walls. But for the first time in months, Lenora Grange found herself wondering if pride might be too expensive a luxury for anyone to afford for long. The wheel Jonah had set in motion with his return was turning faster now. Where it would stop, what changes it would bring, remained hidden in the darkness like rain clouds gathering beyond the horizon. But change was coming to Dry Creek. Some would welcome it, others would fight it, and a few, a precious few, would find themselves transformed by it in ways they never expected. The bread rose in its pans, patient and certain as sunrise. And somewhere in the salt cedars, a man who'd learned to stand after crawling prepared for whatever tomorrow might bring. The fire started just past midnight, when even the saloon had gone quiet and Dry Creek slept under a blanket of stars. It began in the storage room behind Grange and Daughter Bakery, where the old stovepipe had developed a crack no one had noticed. A spark found spilled flour. Flour found wooden shelves. And suddenly, the night bloomed orange. Lenora woke to the smell of smoke and the terrible crackling of her world burning down. She flew from her bed above the shop, feet bare on the warm floorboards. The smoke was already thick, turning the familiar stairs into a choking maze. "Papa!" she screamed, forgetting for a moment that he was gone, that the room down the hall held only his things, not him. Then she remembered what did occupy that room: her father's iron-bound chest with the family papers, his watch, her mother's Bible. But more urgent was the sound coming from there, desperate thumping against the floor. The night exploded with voices as Dry Creek woke to disaster. The church bell clanged its bronze alarm. Men tumbled from their beds, pulling on boots and grabbing buckets. Fire in a desert town was death if not fought fast and hard. Jonah had been sleeping light, the way men do when they've learned trouble keeps no schedule. At the first clang of the bell, he was up and moving. Karma seemed to sense the urgency, standing ready as Jonah threw blankets over his back, wet blankets from the creek, grabbed on the run. The scene on Main Street was organized chaos. A bucket brigade had formed from the nearest well, but anyone could see it was too little against flames that now licked from the bakery's upper windows. Women corralled children to safety, while men fought the beast that ate wood and hope with equal hunger. "There's someone upstairs!" Jake Braden shouted over the roar. Saw movement in the window. That's when Jonah saw her. Lenora at her bedroom window, trying to open it. The wood had swollen with heat, trapping her. Without thought, he dropped from Karma and pushed through the crowd. "Pike, don't be a fool!" Marshal Cooper grabbed his arm. "Whole thing's gonna come down." Jonah shook him off, wrapping a wet blanket around himself like armor against the heat. He kicked in the front door and plunged into hell. The bottom floor was a furnace. Flour in the air had turned to fuel, creating brief, explosive flashes. Jonah dropped to his knees, crawling like he had that day on this same floor. But now, with purpose instead of desperation, the stairs groaned under him, each step a gamble against collapse. He found Lenora in the hallway, not at her window, but struggling with her father's door. The old man wasn't dead after all. Thomas Grange lay half-paralyzed from a stroke that had taken him silent months ago. A secret Lenora had kept to preserve his dignity and the bakery's reputation. "Can't leave him," she gasped, pulling uselessly at his dead weight. Jonah didn't waste words. He shouldered past her, gathered the old man in his arms. Thomas Grange weighed no more than a child, wasted by months of illness. His eyes, still alert in that frozen face, met Jonah's with desperate gratitude. "Follow close," Jonah ordered Lenora. "Keep low." They descended into an inferno. The stairs gave way 3 steps from the bottom, plunging them into a hell of smoke and ember. Jonah twisted to take the impact, protecting the old man. His shoulder struck hard, sending lightning through his body, but he rolled and kept moving. The front door might as well have been miles away. Fire had spread to block their path, hungry tongues licking at the walls. Jonah made a choice. He charged straight through, blanket smoking, lungs screaming for air. Behind him, Lenora followed, coughing and stumbling. They burst onto the street like souls escaping damnation. Jonah's blanket was smoldering, his face black with soot. He laid Thomas Grange gentle on the ground, where Doc Morrison, sober for once, rushed to attend him. Only then did Jonah realize Lenora hadn't made it out. The crowd's shouting turned to screams as part of the roof collapsed, sending a pillar of sparks into the night sky. Jonah was moving before thought could stop him, but this time the fire had won. The doorway was a solid wall of flame. "No!" The word tore from his throat, primal and fierce. He looked wild around, saw what he needed: a rain barrel. nearly full. Without pause, he upended it over himself, soaking every inch, then wrapped the charred blanket around his head and charged. Later, witnesses would swear they saw him disappear into flame and emerge carrying an angel. In truth, he found Lenora collapsed just inside the door, overcome by smoke. Her shoulder hung wrong where she'd fallen, but she was breathing. He threw her over his good shoulder and ran. They made it 10 feet before the rest of the roof came down, the crash shaking the ground like thunder. Burning debris rained down, but they were clear, alive. Impossible as that seemed. Jonah laid Lenora beside her father. She was conscious but dazed, her dislocated shoulder making her whimper with each movement. Miss Odie appeared from the crowd, taking charge with her herbs and wisdom. "Hold her steady," she instructed Jonah. Then, to Lenora, "This is gonna hurt fierce, girl. Bite on this." She offered a piece of leather. Lenora's eyes found Jonah's face. Tears had cut channels through the soot on her cheeks. "I'm not worth saving," she whispered. "That's not how it works," Jonah replied. "Fire doesn't choose who deserves to burn, neither do I." Miss Odie gripped Lenora's arm, pulled with the precise knowledge of someone who'd done this before. The joint slipped back into place with a sound like a branch breaking. Lenora's scream was muffled by leather and pride as the bakery collapsed into itself, sending a final shower of sparks toward the stars. The people of Dry Creek stood silent. Everything Lenora owned, everything her father had built over 20 years, was gone. The Granges were ruined. "We'll take them to my place," Miss Odie announced. "Need tending, both of them." Men lifted Thomas Grange gentle as they could. Lenora tried to stand but swayed, her good hand reaching out blind. Jonah caught her before she fell. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "I know you can," he said. "Question is, will you let someone help?" She looked up at him, this man she'd humiliated, who'd pulled her from flame without hesitation. Something broke in her expression, a wall finally crumbling. She nodded, just once. Jonah lifted her careful, mindful of her shoulder. She weighed little more than her father, as if pride and anger had been the only things giving her substance. Her head fell against his chest, and he felt her tears soak through his shirt. The crowd parted as they passed. Some nodded, some touched their hats. Old Walter Haynes stepped forward. "We'll mount a watch," he said gruff. "Make sure the fire doesn't spread." Others murmured agreement. The crisis had shaken something loose in Dry Creek, reminded them they were community before they were individuals. Jake Braden was already organizing teams to contain the remaining flames. At Miss Odie's cabin, they laid the Granges on pallets. Thomas's breathing was labored but steady. Lenora sat silent as Miss Odie tended her shoulder, binding it tight with strips of cloth. "Why?" she finally asked Jonah, who was washing soot from his burned hands. "After what I did." "You already asked that," he reminded her. "Answer hasn't changed." "But She stopped, struggled, started again. "I laughed. When you were starving, I laughed." "Yes," he agreed simply. "You did." The acknowledgement hurt worse than denial would have. Lenora closed her eyes. "I hear it sometimes, my own laugh, like a stranger's voice, cruel and—" She trailed off. "We all got voices we'd rather not hear." Jonah said, "Trick is deciding which ones to listen to going forward." Young Amos appeared at the door, leading Karma. "Thought you'd want him close," the boy said. Jonah smiled, first real smile Lenora had seen from him. It transformed his face, hinting at the man he'd been before loss carved its marks. "Good thinking, boy." Through the rest of that long night, they kept vigil. Miss Odie brewed her teas, treating burns and smoke-damaged lungs. Thomas Grange slept fitful, sometimes crying out wordless. Lenora dozed between waves of pain, her injured shoulder a constant reminder of how much could be lost in moments. As dawn painted the sky pink and gold, Jonah stood outside watching smoke still rise from the bakery's remains. Amos joined him, quiet in that way children learn when they've seen too much too young. "What happens to them now?" the boy asked. That's up to them. Jonah replied, Fire takes everything, but it also clears ground for new growth. Question is what they choose to plant. Behind them, through the cabin's thin walls, they heard Lenora's voice, broken but determined. I'll rebuild, she was telling Miss Odie. Don't know how, but I'll rebuild, and this time… She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Some promises are made in silence, witnessed only by conscience and the ashes of what we used to be. The sun climbed higher, indifferent as always to human suffering and human redemption alike. But in its light, even ruins could look like possibility. And in a cabin among the salt cedars, two people who'd met at the extremes of human experience, one crawling, one laughing, began the slow work of building something new from the ashes of pride and pain. 2 weeks after the fire, Lenora Grange drove the first stake into the ground where her bakery had stood. The lot was cleared now, the ashes and char hauled away by volunteers who'd appeared each morning without being asked. She wore a borrowed dress from Martha Perkins, her injured arm still bound, but healing. Her father watched from a chair in the shade, his eyes the only part of him that could show approval. Not there, Jonah said, stepping from behind a pile of salvaged lumber. Foundation was compromised by the heat. Build there. You'll have cracks come winter. Lenora straightened, still learning to accept help without bristling. Where then? He walked the lot, testing the ground with the iron rod. Here. He marked a spot 10 feet over. Ground solid. And you'll catch morning sun earlier, good for rising dough. She moved her stake without argument. 2 weeks ago, such easy surrender would have been impossible. But fire had a way of burning away more than wood and pride. The new bakery wouldn't be built of lumber alone. Without money for proper construction, Lenora had made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She would build with adobe and salvage, creating an outdoor oven beside a simple shelter. Bread and fire. She'd paint on a board, nothing fancy, just honest. I can pay, she'd told the men who came to help. Not money, but bread. Every morning, fresh bread for any who hunger. It was Jonah who'd suggested she start before the building was complete. Folks need bread now, he'd said, and you need purpose. So she'd borrowed mixing bowls from Miss Odie, bought flour on credit from Sam Henderson at the general store, and begun. The first morning, she'd made 20 loaves in a hastily built clay oven. By the third day, she was making 40. Word spread in that mysterious way of small towns. The baker woman who'd turned away a starving man now gave bread to any who asked. No questions, no payment required unless folks could afford it. Just bread, warm and sustaining. Why? Old Walter Haynes asked one morning, accepting his loaf with gnarled hands. Lenora's hands didn't pause in their kneading. Because a full belly shouldn't depend on a full pocket. She said, took me too long to learn that. The work was hard. Without her father's savings, lost in the fire. She relied on charity she'd once have scorned. But each morning, Jonah appeared to tend the fire while she mixed dough. He never asked. She never thanked him. They worked in companionable silence, finding rhythm in shared labor. Young Amos became their third partner, running deliveries to folks who couldn't make the walk. Mrs. Murphy says bless you, he'd report. And the widow Torres sends these eggs in trade. Slowly, the outdoor bakery became more than a place for bread. Men would gather while the loaves baked, sharing news and work gossip. Women brought their mending. Sitting in the shade Jonah had created with a simple ramada, children played in the dirt while their mothers waited. It's becoming something, Miss Odie observed one afternoon, watching the informal gathering. More than you planned. Nothing's gone according to plan, Lenora admitted, checking her loaves. Her hands, once soft and white, now showed burns and calluses. Maybe that's better. The transformation wasn't just in the bakery. Lenora herself was changing, like metal in a forge. The sharp edges of her beauty softened. The cruel wit that had been her weapon became gentle humor. She learned people's names, their troubles, their joys. My Lenny. Thomas Grange managed one evening, his few working fingers reaching for her hand. The stroke had stolen most of his words, but love needed few. "I'm here, Papa," she assured him, squeezing gentle. "We're going to be fine." But fine was a relative term in Dry Creek. The strangers in black dusters hadn't left town. They'd taken rooms at the hotel, spending their days watching and their nights planning something that made honest folks nervous. "They were asking about you," Jake Braden warned Jonah one afternoon. "Wanted to know where you'll learn to handle timber and men." "What did you tell them?" "Nothing, but they're not the type to accept nothing for long." Jonah nodded, filing the information away. He'd known men like these before, carrion birds who circled trouble, waiting to feed. Whatever they wanted, it wouldn't be good for Dry Creek. The confrontation came on a Sunday, when most folks were at church or sleeping off Saturday night. Jonah was working on the bakery's frame, setting posts for what would be walls. Lenora was inside the temporary shelter, her father napping in the shade. "Industrious man," a voice observed. Jonah didn't turn. He recognized the oiled tone of Silas Creed, the taller stranger. "Work needs doing." "Indeed it does." Creed moved into view, his partner Vale flanking him. "In fact, we have work that needs a man of your particular skills. Not interested? Haven't heard our offer yet?" Now Jonah did turn, hammer still in hand. "Don't need to. I know your type. Whatever you're selling, Dry Creek doesn't need." Vale smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Dry Creek needs plenty. Progress, development. The railroad's coming through. Friend, town can either profit or be left behind. Railroad's not coming through here." Jonah said, "Surveyed the route myself. Years back, grades too steep, water too scarce." The strangers exchanged glances. "Maps can be redrawn," Creed said carefully, "for the right incentives." "You mean for the right threats?" The temperature seemed to drop despite the blazing sun. Vale's hand drifted toward his coat. "Careful, friend. Words like that can be unhealthy. So can preying on honest folks." Jonah's grip on the hammer was loose. "Ready. Whatever scheme you're running, run it somewhere else." Creed studied him like a problem to be solved. "You know, I had you figured wrong. Thought you were smart. Man who rises from nothing usually understands opportunity. I understand plenty, including what happens to towns that deal with men like you. Pity." Creed adjusted his hat. "Well, if you won't be reasonable, perhaps others will. The baker woman, for instance. Lost everything, didn't she? Might be grateful for a chance to rebuild properly." The hammer moved so fast they barely saw it. It sank into the post beside Creed's head, vibrating like a tuning fork. "You stay away from her. Protective," Vale observed. "Interesting. The woman who shamed you, and you defend her. I defend what's right. She's found her way. You won't drag her back." Creed pulled the hammer free, examined it. "Everyone has a price. Pike, everyone has something they can't afford to lose." He set the hammer on the ground. "We'll be around." They walked away unhurried, shadows long in the afternoon sun. Jonah watched until they turned the corner, then quickly moved to check on Lenora and her father. He found her standing in the doorway, flour-dusted and fierce. "I heard," she said. "They'll come at you now. Try to use your debts." "Let them try." Her voice carried new steel. "I've been at bottom. Jonah, found out it's not the fall that kills you, it's the staying down." She met his eyes steady. "I'm not staying down." Something passed between them in that look, understanding deeper than words. They'd both been broken, both rebuilt. Now they stood on common ground, shaped by fire and choice. That evening, as bread cooled and shadows lengthened, they sat with Thomas watching stars appear. The old man dozed, peaceful in his chair. Amos had gone home to Miss Odie's. The world felt suspended, balanced on the edge of change. "I need to tell you something," Lenora said quiet. "About that day, when you came begging." "You don't—" "I do." She took a breath. "I wasn't laughing at you. I was laughing at fear, at seeing myself in you, broken, desperate. It scared me so bad I had to make it cruel. Make it other. Does that make sense? Jonah considered. Fear makes us do strange things. Question is what we do after. After? She smiled, small but real. After, we bake bread. After, we build things worth keeping. They sat in comfortable silence. Two people who'd found grace in the last place they'd expected, each other's company. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Creed Vale wouldn't give up easy. The town would need to choose its path. But tonight, there was bread cooling and stars rising and the quiet understanding that sometimes the best redemption is the kind we build with our own hands. One day at a time. In the distance, karma whickered, and night birds began their songs. The wheel of change kept turning, but for now, this moment of peace was enough. The morning the development committee arrived. Dry Creek smelled of fresh bread and trouble. 3 men in city suits stepped off the stage, carrying leather cases and papers sealed with official wax. Behind them came Marshal Swain from the county seat, young, ambitious, with eyes cold as winter steel. Lenora saw them first, pausing in her kneading as the delegation marched down Main Street like they owned it. Jonah, she called soft. He emerged from behind the new wall he'd been framing, took in the scene with one long look. It's starting, he said. The committee set up in the hotel, sending word for all property owners to attend a town meeting that afternoon. The message was clear. Come voluntarily or be compelled. They can't just take our land, Sam Henderson protested to the gathering crowd. They can if it's for the public good. Jake Braden replied, spitting tobacco juice. Seen it before. Railroad wants a depot. Suddenly your farm's in the way of progress. By 3 o'clock, the hotel's main room was packed. The committee sat at a table up front like judges at a trial. Creed Vale lounged in the corner, satisfied as cats with cream. The head committeeman, a soft-bellied fellow named Cornelius Bright, stood and cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, we come bearing excellent news. The Southwestern Railroad Corporation has chosen Dry Creek as a major depot location. This means prosperity, growth, connection to the wider world. What's the catch? Jonah asked from the back. Bright's smile was practiced. No catch, Mr. Pike. Ah, yes, the hero of the mine rescue. Well, Mr. Pike, there are simple necessities. The depot requires space. The current layout of your quaint town doesn't accommodate modern needs. He unrolled a map. The proposed depot sat square where Bread and Fire was rebuilding, extending through 6 other properties. Naturally, fair compensation will be offered. Define fair, Lenora said. Stepping forward, Flower still dusted her dress, but she stood straight as any lady. Market value is assessed by our experts. Bright replied smooth, plus a small bonus for cooperation. And if we don't cooperate, Marshal Swain spoke for the first time, then we proceed with eminent domain, legal and proper, but less generous. The room erupted. Voices raised in anger, fear, confusion. Through it all, Jonah watched Creed Vale. This was their doing, he was certain. But why? What was their real game? Enough! Miss Odie's voice cut through the chaos. The small woman commanded attention by sheer presence. You come here with papers and threats, talking about our good. Did you ask what we consider good? Progress benefits everyone, Bright insisted. Does it? She looked around the room. Progress took my people's land once before. Called it manifest destiny then. Least this time you're offering coins for conscience. The decision has been made, Swain said cold. You have 1 week to accept the offers. After that, he shrugged. After that, you'll face more than paper. Jonah said quiet but clear. This town's been through drought, disease, and fire. We're still here. You might want to consider what that means. Swain's hand moved to his gun. That sounds like a threat. It's a fact. Jonah met his gaze steady. Push people too far, they push back. Badge doesn't change that. The tension stretched taut before Bright raised a calming hand. Let's not be dramatic. We're civilized men. 1 week to consider. I'm sure you'll see reason. The meeting broke up. But folks didn't scatter. They gathered in small groups, voices low and urgent. At Bread and Fire, a larger group formed, the displaced property owners, their neighbors, anyone who saw their future in the railroad's path. We could fight it in court, Henderson suggested. With what money? Martha Perkins asked, bitter. They know we're broke from the drought. What if we weren't? Lenora said suddenly. All eyes turned to her. What if we pooled resources, made our own offer? For what? For an alternative. There's land east of town, flat and empty. Why not build there? We could donate it collectively, keep our homes and give them their depot. Hope flickered in tired faces. But Vale, who drifted closer, laughed sharp. Charming. But the decision's made. That eastern land is alkali flat, worthless. Your properties have value. That's business. People aren't business. Amos piped up, brave in his youth. Everything's business, boy, Creed added, joining his partner. Your baker friend here knows that. Don't you, Miss Grange? Your father borrowed heavy before he took sick. Those notes are due soon. Lenora went white. Those were private loans. Banks sold them last week. 2 interested parties. His smile was razor thin. Funny how debts come due right when you need leverage. You bastards, Jonah said conversational-like. Business, Vale corrected. Accept the railroad offer. Miss Grange, and those debts disappear. Fight it. He spread his hands. Get out, Lenora said, voice shaking. Get out of my place. They tipped their hats and sauntered away. The crowd stood stunned, seeing clear now the trap that had been laid. How much? Jonah asked, quiet. $800, Lenora whispered. Papa borrowed for new equipment. Before... She couldn't finish. 800 might as well be 8,000 in Dry Creek. The crowd began to disperse, hope dying like sparks on water. But Jonah caught Lenora's arm gentle. We're not done, he said. Not by half. That night, while Dry Creek slept fitful, Jonah rode out. He returned near dawn, dusty and grim. Miller's Station, Willow Fork, Sage Flats. He told the gathered conspirators. Same story everywhere. Railroads grabbing land along a line that makes no sense, unless they know something we don't. What could they know? Braden asked. Jonah pulled out a worn survey map, his own from years back. I kept wondering why they'd route through here. Grade's wrong. Water's scarce. Then I remembered. He pointed to marks on the map. Copper veins. Found them surveying, but too deep for profitable mining. Unless you're not really building a railroad, Miss Odie finished. You're grabbing mineral rights. The pieces fell into place. The railroad was a front. Grab the land cheap. Discover the copper later. Make fortunes while towns died. Can we prove it? Henderson asked. Not in a week, Jonah admitted. But we can make it costly enough they might reconsider. They plan through the day, not violence. That would bring troops. But resistance has many forms. As word spread, something shifted in Dry Creek's spirit. Fear became determination. Isolation became unity. The next morning, when Bright emerged from the hotel, he found Main Street transformed. Every building flew a hand-painted banner. Dry Creek stands together. Folks went about their business, but different. They moved in groups. They watched. They waited. At Bread and Fire, a new sign appeared. Free bread today. Strength for the fight. The line stretched around the block. Lenora worked without pause, Jonah beside her. Their movements synchronized by shared purpose. They'll come hard now, he warned during a brief break. Let them. She wiped sweat from her brow, leaving a flour streak. I've lost everything once. Survived. This time, I'm not alone. She was right. As the sun climbed, more folks arrived. Not just to eat, but to stand. To be counted. The blacksmith set up his anvil beside the ovens. The seamstress brought her work. Soon, half the town's business was being conducted in the shadow of Bread and Fire. Swain arrived at noon, badge glinting. This is illegal assembly. It's a bakery, old Walter replied, mild. Folks get hungry. Don't test me, old man. Or what? Miss Odie stepped forward. You'll arrest us for eating? For working? Your papers give you right to our land, not our lives. The standoff stretched taut. Swain's hand hovered near his gun, but even he could count. 30 people, 40, more arriving. 1 week, he finally said. Then this ends, one way or another. As he stalked away, Lenora caught Jonah's eye. Something passed between them, not hope exactly, but resolve. They'd changed things before, him from beggar to builder, her from cruel to kind. Maybe they could change this too. Back to work. Jonah called out, "Day's wasting." But it wasn't wasted. Every loaf baked, every board hammered, every person who stood instead of knelt. It all mattered. They were writing a different story now, word by word, deed by deed. And in the hotel, Bright worried into his whiskey while Creed and Vale recalculated odds. They'd expected sheep. They'd found something else entirely. The wheel Jonah had named Karma kept turning, and only time would tell where it would stop. The morning Marshal Swain returned with official eviction papers. He brought backup, 6 deputies with rifles and dead eyes. They found Dry Creek transformed. Every building on the condemned list had people standing shoulder to shoulder in front, creating a human wall. At Bread and Fire, Lenora stood center, her father in his chair beside her. The whole town had turned out. "By order of the Territorial Court," Swain announced, voice carrying over the silent crowd. "These properties are hereby seized for public use. Disperse immediately or face arrest." Nobody moved. "This is your last warning," Swain said, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He'd expected fear, not this quiet defiance. "You going to arrest the whole town?" Jake Braden asked from his spot in the line. "If necessary." "With 6 men?" Miss Odie's voice was mild as spring water. "Marshal, I've delivered half the babies in this county. You planning to put their mothers in chains?" The deputies shifted uncomfortable. These weren't nameless resistors. They saw faces they knew, people who'd helped them, fed them, tended their kin. It was then that Jonah played their ace. "Marshal Swain," he called out. "Before you proceed, might want to read this." He pulled out a telegram, fresh from the morning stage. "It's from Governor Wallace's office." Swain snatched the paper, read, and his face went dark. "This is impossible. Wire the Capitol yourself if you doubt it." Jonah suggested, "Seems someone sent documentation about mineral deposits on condemned lands. Governors launched an investigation into the railroad's true intentions. All seizures are suspended pending review." The crowd held its breath. This was the gambit. 3 days ago, Jonah and Henderson had ridden hard to the nearest telegraph station, sending packets of surveys, claim records, and correspondence to every newspaper and government office they could think of. They'd spent every penny the town could scrape together on telegrams and postage. "This changes nothing," Swain snarled. 1 week, 1 month, result'll be the same." "Maybe," Jonah agreed. "But time has a way of revealing truth." That's when Esther Coulter arrived. She stepped down from a dusty carriage like royalty, visiting peasants, silk dress, Eastern manners, and eyes sharp as cut glass. Behind her came 2 men with the look of lawyers, carrying cases that probably held more power than guns. "Marshal Swain," she said, voice carrying despite its softness. "Miss Esther Coulter, representing the Coulter Foundation. I understand there's some dispute over land rights." Swain looked like he'd swallowed a scorpion. Everyone knew the Coulter name. Old money, older influence. "This is a local matter, ma'am." "Is it?" She surveyed the scene, taking in the human chain, the banners, the unified resistance. "Because I see a community under threat. My late husband believed in investing in communities, not destroying them." She walked past Swain like he was furniture, approaching Lenora. "You must be Miss Grange. I've heard about your bread program. Feeding anyone who hungers, regardless of ability to pay?" "Yes, ma'am," Lenora managed, thrown by this unexpected ally. "Admirable. The kind of initiative my foundation supports." She turned to address the crowd. I'm here because someone sent compelling documentation about financial irregularities and suspicious land grabs. My lawyers are very interested. Creed and Vale, watching from the hotel porch, exchanged dark looks. This wasn't in their plan. Furthermore, Esther continued, I'm prepared to purchase defaulted loans at face value, returning them to original terms, starting with yours, Miss Grange. Lenore's legs nearly buckled. We can't repay. Did I mention repayment? Consider it an investment in community development. My lawyers will handle details. The crowd stirred, hope sparking like flint on steel. But Swain wasn't finished. You can't just... Can't I? Esther's smile was winter-sweet. Marshall, do you know who holds your appointment? Commissioner Banks is my cousin. Perhaps we should discuss your future. The transformation was instant. Swain's belligerence melted like snow in summer. Perhaps we've been hasty. If the governor's investigating... A wise reconsideration. She turned back to the crowd. I'll be staying at the hotel for the week. Anyone facing foreclosure or suspicious offers, please see my associates. We'll review everything. As quick as it started, the confrontation ended. Swain and his deputies retreated, leaving confusion in their wake. The crowd began to disperse, but slowly, reluctant to abandon their victory formation. How? Lenora asked Jonah quiet-like. How did she know to come? He showed her a second telegram, this one older. Remember I said I surveyed for the railroad years back? Made friends. One works for the Coulter Foundation now. When our wires about copper reached him. He shrugged. You planned this? Hoped. Planning's too strong a word when you're betting on conscience. That evening, Dry Creek celebrated cautious. The immediate threat had passed, but everyone knew the war wasn't over. At Bread and Fire, folks gathered natural-like, sharing food and stories. Esther Coulter surprised everyone by joining them, sitting on a rough bench and accepting a bowl of Miss Odie's stew with grace. My husband started poor. She told them, built his fortune but never forgot hunger. He'd have loved this, people standing together, sharing what they have. As night fell, couples danced to fiddle music. Children chased fireflies. For a moment, fear gave way to joy. Lenora found herself watching Jonah across the fire, saw him laughing at something Amos said. When their eyes met, she felt something shift in her chest, a wall finally crumbling complete. Dance? He asked, appearing at her elbow. I don't know how. She admitted. Papa thought dancing was frivolous. Most good things are. He held out his hand. Trust me? She did. They moved awkward at first, her stepping on his boots, him trying to lead gentle. But gradually they found rhythm, swaying to the fiddle's sweet complaint. Thank you, she said against his shoulder. For everything. For saving us. Didn't save anyone. Just reminded folks they could save themselves. That's not what I meant. She pulled back to see his face. That first day, when I shamed you, you could have left me to burn. Could have taken revenge a dozen ways. Instead you... Her voice caught. Instead, I got to see who you really are. He finished. Under the pride and fear. Got to watch you become the woman who feeds anyone who hungers. Fair trade, I'd say. Around them, Dry Creek danced on. Unaware they were witnessing another kind of redemption. Two people finding grace in each other's eyes. But not everyone celebrated. In the hotel, Creed and Vale met with Bright, voices low and urgent. This changes nothing essential. Creed insisted. The Foundation can't protect everyone. We proceed with alternative measures. What measures? Bright asked, nervous. Vale smiled cold. The kind that don't require legal approval. Outside, old Karma stood patient at the hitching post, black coat silver in moonlight. The horse lifted his head, nostrils flaring as if scenting storm on the wind. Jonah noticed, filling away the warning. The night was sweet with victory, but morning would come with its own challenges. For now, though, Dry Creek danced, and two people who'd met at rock bottom found they could rise together higher than either could alone. Stay, Lenora whispered as the music slowed. Not an invitation to anything improper, just a plea for presence. Don't go back to Miss Odie's yet. Papa likes when you're here. He sleeps better. I'll stay, Jonah promised. They sat by the dying fire as folks drifted home, her father dozing peaceful in his chair. Amos curled on a blanket like a puppy. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. Tomorrow would bring new battles. Creed and Vale wouldn't give up easy, and the railroad had deep pockets. But tonight, Dry Creek had remembered its backbone. Tonight, a woman who'd mocked kindness served bread to anyone who hungered. Tonight, a man who'd crawled in desperation stood tall for others. And somewhere in the darkness, karma wickered soft, as if saying that sometimes the wheel of justice turns slow, but it turns sure. The first snow of winter came early that year, dusting Dry Creek like flour from heaven's kitchen. It was the morning of the first Bread and Fire Festival. 3 months after Esther Coulter had turned the tide, the whole town bustled with preparation, lanterns strung between buildings, tables set long as creek beds, and the smell of baking bread mixing with pine smoke from warming fires. Lenora stood before her new building, no longer just a shelter, but a proper bakery with adobe walls and real glass windows. Above the door hung a sign painted by Amos, "Bread and Fire, all are welcome." Her father sat nearby in his chair, wrapped in quilts, eyes bright as he watched the festivities unfold. "Never thought I'd see it," Jake Braden said, hauling another table into place. Whole town working together like this. It hadn't been easy. After Esther's intervention, Creed and Vale had tried one last desperate move, hiring drifters to cause trouble, spreading lies about water rights, even attempting to burn the new bakery one night. But Dry Creek had learned vigilance. Men took turns standing watch. Women organized supply lines. Even children helped, running messages and keeping lookout. The final blow came when journalists from 3 major newspapers arrived, following up on the corruption story. Their investigations revealed a web of fraud stretching across 5 territories. Creed and Vale disappeared one night, leaving debts and warrants behind. Bright was arrested trying to board a train with suitcases full of bribe money. Now, as snow kissed the ground gentle-like, Dry Creek prepared to celebrate not just survival, but transformation. The Coulter Foundation had made good on its promises. Loans restructured, a new school funded, and official recognition of Bread and Fire as a community trust that could never be sold or seized. "Riders coming," young Samuel Henderson called from his perch on the water tower. Through the snow came Esther Coulter's carriage, but also unexpected guests, delegations from Miller's Station, Willow Fork, and Sage Flats. Word of Dry Creek's resistance had spread, inspiring other towns to stand against the railroad schemes. "We wanted to see it ourselves," the mayor of Miller's Station explained, shaking Jonah's hand, "the town that said no and made it stick." As the sun climbed higher, the festival began in earnest. Long tables groaned under the weight of shared food, not just bread but preserves, smoked meats, dried fruits, everything folks could contribute. Esther had brought city delicacies, but she seemed most pleased with Miss Odie's simple corn cakes. "This is what my husband dreamed of," she told Lenora. "Communities that lift each other up. You've built something precious here." Music started, fiddles and guitars, even a piano hauled from the saloon. Children raced between tables while adults shared stories of the year's struggles and triumphs. Through it all, Lenora worked her ovens, but different now. She had help, women who'd learned her techniques, sharing the load so everyone could also celebrate. As afternoon painted shadows long, Jonah found Lenora taking a rare break, watching the festivities with wonder. "Regrets?" he asked, settling beside her. "None," she said firm. "Well, one." She looked at him sideways. "I regret it took tragedy to teach me kindness." "Maybe that's how most of us learn it," Jonah offered. "Through breaking." They sat comfortable in shared silence until Amos ran up, breathless with excitement. "Miss Lenny! Mr. Jonah! They're calling for you." The crowd had gathered in a circle. Jake Braden stood center, raising his glass. "To the folks who showed us what we could be," he called out. To Jonah Pike, who proved a man can rise from any fall. To Lenora Grange, who feeds bodies and souls alike. And to Dry Creek. May we never forget this year's lessons. The cheer that went up could have shook snow from mountains. But then Esther Coulter raised her hand for silence. I have an announcement, she said. The Foundation is establishing a permanent fund for communities like yours. Places that understand wealth isn't measured in gold, but in how we treat each other. It will be called the Bread and Fire Initiative, and I'd like Miss Grange and Mr. Pike to help oversee it. Lenora gripped Jonah's arm. We couldn't. You couldn't not, Esther corrected gentle. Who better to help other towns find their backbone? As the crowd celebrated this news, Thomas Grange made a sound. Not distress, but urgency. Lenora rushed to him, Jonah close behind. The old man's working hand moved painful, slow, reaching for Jonah. Papa? Lenora asked. With tremendous effort. Thomas managed 2 words, the first he'd spoken clear since his stroke. Thank you. Tears ran free down Lenora's cheeks. Jonah knelt beside the chair, taking the old man's hand firm. No, sir. Thank you for raising a daughter strong enough to change. As evening came on, lanterns were lit against the gathering dark. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing the world clean. Inside the bakery, a smaller gathering formed, the core folks who'd stood together through everything. Seems like a year ago you came crawling down Main Street, Miss Odie observed to Jonah. Lifetime ago. He agreed. And you? She turned to Lenora. Laughing like the world was your enemy? Maybe it was, Lenora said quiet. Maybe I needed to lose everything to find what mattered. Old Walter raised his cup. 2 second chances. 2 third and fourth chances. Braden added. 2 as many chances as it takes. Jonah finished. Outside. Karma stood patient at his post, snow gathering on his black coat like stars. The horse had carried Jonah back to Dry Creek. But more than that, he'd carried the promise that what goes around does indeed come around, just not always how we expect. As the festival wound down, families heading home through the gentle snow. Jonah and Lenora worked side by side cleaning up, natural as breathing now, their movements synchronized by months of shared labor. Stay? She asked as they banked the ovens for the night. Always, he answered, and they both knew he meant more than just tonight. Later, as Dry Creek slept under its blanket of snow, 2 figures could be seen through the bakery window, sitting close by the fire, planning tomorrow's bread and the future beyond. They'd traveled far from that scorching day when one crawled and one laughed. The journey had broken them both, then remade them into something stronger. Spring would come with its own challenges. The Bread and Fire Initiative would take them to other towns, spreading the gospel of community and compassion. There would be setbacks and victories, tears and celebrations. But tonight, in the warmth of the bakery that had risen from ashes, 2 people who'd found each other at rock bottom discovered that love, like good bread, needs time to rise proper. Amos curled near the warmth, dreamed of the wedding that would come with wildflower season, simple and sincere, with the whole town celebrating 2 people who'd taught them all about falling and rising, breaking and building, and the everyday miracle of sharing what we have. The sign above the door creaked gentle in the wind. Bread and fire, all are welcome. And in Dry Creek, at least, it was true. The town that had laughed at a starving man had learned to feed whoever hungered. The woman who'd poured mockery like water had learned to pour compassion instead. And the man who'd crawled had shown them all how to stand. Some stories end with sunset rides and dramatic declarations. This one ends with the simple promise of bread rising in the morning, of work shared and burdens halved, of a community that chose connection over commerce, and 2 people who discovered that the best revenge is indeed a life well lived, together, in the last warm corner of the night, as snow whispered secrets against windows. Karma wickered soft, as if to say the wheel had turned full circle at last, and the karma was good. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. Where are you enjoying this tale from? Leave a comment below to let us know and connect with fellow listeners. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Jonah and Lenora's journey. What touched your heart most in their story of redemption and community?